Okay, so we're going to get started. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for an intimate discussion with Scott Shay. I'm Nina Walden, Managing Director of Chai Mitzvah. Before we get started, I just want to review some Zoom etiquette with you. So please sign in the chat box. We'd love to see where you're from, so include your name and where you're joining from. Please make sure you're muted so that we can all hear the program easily. Scott Shay will speak about his book, In Good Faith, Questioning Religion and Atheism, and then we'll open up for questions and discussion. We're looking forward to your questions and comments, so please put them in the chat box and we'll share them. Now here's Audrey Lichter, Executive Director of Chai Mitzvah, to introduce Scott and begin the program.
Hi, welcome everyone. So I will introduce Scott, who many of you know and know of his work. Scott is a prominent New York business leader, philanthropist, and community leader. His successful career spans Wall Street, private equity, venture capital, and banking. Currently, he is founder and chairman of Signature Bank. Scott is a graduate of the J.L. Kellogg Graduate School of Management at Northwestern University, a distinguished leader in the Jewish community. His excellent organizational skills have led to his appointment to the boards of local and national and international Jewish organizations, including the New York Federation, Birthright, and Or Torah Stone. Scott is the author of nationally acclaimed Getting Our Groove Back, How to Energize American Jewry, and his book, In Good Faith, Questioning Religion and Atheism, was recognized by Mosaic Authors as one of the best books of 2018 and earned a finalist award from the National Jewish Books. He is board founder and president of Chai Mitzvah. Scott gives talks around the country and is interviewed on TV, radio, and podcasts many times throughout the year. He and his wife Susan live in New York City and have 4 grown children. Scott?
Thank you, Audrey, and thank you, Nina. It's really a pleasure to be with this group tonight. It's just going to be a little different talk. Can everyone hear me? Thumbs up? Okay.
Yes.
Great. So it really is a pleasure to be with you, and this talk is going to be a little different than most of my talks. I'd say in the last 6 months or so, most of the talking that I've done, most of the speaking that I've done has really been in the Christian community or the secular community. And this is much more of a Jewish group, if I can, I think I'm safe in saying that. And also, I'm going to be talking, assuming that most people have some familiarity with the work that I've done and with the book. So I'm not going to start from scratch. I'm going to start from a sort of general level of understanding, and I hope that's going to work. Although I'm going to speak as though I'm going to unpack ideas from scratch. So for those of you who aren't as familiar, you'll catch up real quick, I'm sure. Sometimes when you write a book, the book gets naturally dated or stale, or new events happen that somehow cause you to rethink what you've written or overtake what's written in the book. And the strange thing that's happened in my experience over the last few years, so since 2018, September 2018, when the book was published, is that to a great degree, I feel like the book has become more immediate, more achshavi, as they would say in Ivrit, in terms of what's going on in our day-to-day life. And as those of you who read my book know, one of the big themes of the book is idolatry, is how we should treat each other, is notions of justice, is notions of what empire and colonialism mean. And those are topics that frankly have erupted over the last few years. Also, as you know, the middle chapter in the book, chapter 3 or section 3, is all about good and evil. And how do we understand good and evil in the modern world? How do we differentiate between natural evil, human evil? What are our responsibilities with respect to evil? How can we combat evil? When is evil systemic? And how to combat that as well? And what is systemic evil to a great degree? So so most of you know that a central concept of the book is, and of what I've been talking about, is the concept of idolatry. And idolatry, the way the Bible explains it and the way I define it a little more succinctly, isn't some sort of quaint bowing down to idols. It's more about what idolatry really is, which is a set of lies about power. It's about ascribing super authority or superpowers to finite beings, people like ourselves, individuals, natural processes, ideologies, and the like. And we may think that, we just celebrated Passover about 3 weeks ago, that we defeated, the god King Pharaoh, and idolatry is just something we can forget about. But in reality, the whole 20th century was a catalog of god, king, emperors just like Pharaoh. Stalin, Pol Pot, the Assad family, the Kim family, Hitler, of course. And I could go on and on. We could talk about the Chinese Communist Party and currently, all of which use the same, and I really mean the same, tropes of poetry, pageantry, myth, and theater, all of course backed up by powerful armies and secret police and informers. And it's the way that Stalin, just to take it for a moment, it's the way Stalin got away with starving a quarter of the Ukraine. We now see Russia massing on the Ukraine. Not so many years ago, the leader of the Soviet Union starved, or the leader of Russia starved a quarter of the Ukraine, killed all the Cossacks, sent tens of millions, of course, to the Gulag, never to return. And we see it again, unfortunately, in the Xinjiang province, where we see modern day internment camps. Whether you want to call them internment camps, concentration camps, they're not good places. Vocational camps, as the Chinese Communist Party likes to call them, vocational retraining camps. They're not good places, and they're not places that we as humanity should be proud exist. And by the way, if you want to watch on YouTube the celebration of the 70th anniversary of the ascension of power of the Chinese Communist Party, you will be reminded of biblical processions of idolaters pretty quickly. And I actually commend anybody to just Google it or put it in YouTube and just watch the way that idolatry is really expressed, and how all of the participants get to feel a taste of the God King's power, but yet submit to it at the same time. So all of these things are happening quickly and immediately. And I just want to say one more thing, which is we're used to thinking, and I'm used to thinking about idolatry on a macro basis, Stalin, Hitler, and the like, but the whole list. But in reality, idolatry can take place at the level of our most intimate encounters. So how did Charlie Rose and Harvey Weinstein and Matt Lauer and the list goes, really, Eric Schneiderman, the list goes on and on and on and on, Kevin Spacey, how did they get away with what they got away with? Well, Charlie Rose, just to take one of them, and the rest all follow this, he was an idol at CBS. His word was truth. What the Chinese Communist Party says is truth. What Stalin says is truth. What Hitler said was truth. Obviously, these folks don't think they have superpowers, nor do they command armies. But they, on a sort of an individual level, they were like God kings because they were unquestioned and unquestionable. And it was only when there were enough folks who rose up that those idols could be toppled. So we're in this strange time. And I think part of understanding the strangeness of it is understanding that idolatry is really no one could tell him anything but what he wanted to hear, or else they were gone. They were gone. And today, again, people are aligning with whoever they think is telling them the revealed truth. And these are, in many cases, God King Pharaohs or avatars of them. And we're following that again on the far left and on the far right. And that's a real problem, because when you take truth from your God King and you feel you have a direct line to your God King, well, then people who don't follow your God King seem to become a little less human. And sadly, we saw that play out in spades during the Holocaust, where Jews were not considered human. They weren't part of the Nazi truths. And so they could just be killed, murdered with impunity. Yesterday, we just commemorated, April 19th was the rising of the Warsaw Ghetto. And just rereading what happened and how people rose up when they had basically a few handguns and a few hand grenades and tried to take on the Nazi German army is just breathtaking, heartbreaking. They really can go downhill pretty fast. And I worry, and I have to say, I worry about the modern age. I worry about the fact that as things become more complicated, as science becomes more complicated,
If you're ready, yeah.
then we want to look toward people who are, we want to look toward people who will tell us the simple truth, who will tell us things that we want to hear, how we want to hear them. And that's really, really the harbinger of bad times in history, when we need things overly simplified, when we need to just be able to park our brains at the door and follow a charismatic leader. And again, that's not just on one side or the other. Frankly, I'd feel better if we were on one side or the other, because then we could try to rise up more easily and defeat that sort of thing. But sadly, we have all sorts of God King Pharaohs rising up. Some are more dangerous than others, some are more immediate than others, but they're there. We also, and I would say this, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot that I wrote about in the book, which is the meaning of imperialism the meaning of colonialism, and how we can grapple with that and how we can fight imperialism. The Bible is anti-imperialist. There's no question about it. The idea that groups should conquer other lands is and expand their empires and impose their languages is really criticized everywhere in the Bible. Now we can talk about it, and we might in the chat, if you want, or in the Q&A, talk about the one exception that was made, which was the Israelite conquest of Canaan. But other than that, there's nothing good that's ever said about a conqueror or about the notion of trying to conquer some other land and impose upon that other land your language or your culture or your values. And indeed, the Israelites are forbidden from really dramatically going beyond their borders. So there's a lot that we could talk about. There's a lot that's relevant to today, and literally even today, because we can talk also about justice. And I'm just going to say one more thing, because there's a lot of talk these days about what is systemic racism and what is systemic discrimination. And those are important topics. And I do continue to believe that from when I wrote this book is that the wellspring of systemic discrimination of any sort is idolatry. Because once you depart from that notion that we're all created, as it says in the first chapter of Genesis, with a spark of divinity, with B'Tselem Elohim, and you think that I have my own God King, I'm part of this group, and that I don't have that bond link, equivalent link with humanity, that I don't recognize the divinity in every other person, then there is tremendous risk. And that other group, which could be due to race, creed, color, it's easy to rationalize all sorts of harm toward them. And that's really, I think, one key, and not the only key, I'm certainly not going to say that, but that's one key to understanding this systemic discrimination, systemic racism.
I'm going to go ahead and make the salmon.
Oh, good. Okay.
And I'm glad I'm making people hungry. So with that, I'm going to open it to questions, to comments, and I hope I've teed it up, and I look forward to the conversation.
Anybody who has a question, please type it into the chat box, and that'll be a good way for us to get started.
So Scott, there's a question about whether or not it's important to believe in a supernatural God to live a life without idolatry. What's the role of a monotheistic supernatural God in your view?
So here's the thing. When we talk about higher authority, I'm in favor of believing in a higher authority, but not an idolatrous higher authority. In other words, a monotheistic higher authority. So Richard Dawkins famously said that monotheism is good. You know why? Because people used to believe in hundreds of gods. Then they started believing in 3 or maybe 1 God. And that's all on the correct destination to 0 gods. And so he thought monotheism in that sense was was progress. But in reality, we can believe in more than one God. And then that turns into exactly what I was talking about, which is believing that various people have their own gods. The idea of a monotheistic God that created everybody, that makes us all brothers and sisters, is vital to human harmony, because then we believe that we do share that spark of human, that spark of divinity, that spark that we're all brothers. We all share that same nature of that same spark of divinity. And everybody else who we look at may have a different, may look a little different, may be a little different, but they still have that spark of divinity. Now, here's where I'm going to say that I agree with Richard Dawkins. I would rather someone believe in no God than many gods. Because if you're a true atheist, you're not an idolater. I talk about this at some length in the book, but the risk is, and I've spent a lot of time, frankly, since book tour, I've spent even more time talking to atheists. And here's the interesting thing. Most atheists believe in something. It's like G.K. Chesterton said, that when people stop believing in God, they'll believe in anything. And so I'll talk to people who are on book tour. I'll talk to people at Google when I gave a Google talk afterward, who will tell me they're an atheist, but they believe in certain new agey stuff. They believe in certain politicians whose word is truth to them, whose word is truth. And it's amazing what some folks believe. And they'll say they're an atheist and they don't believe in God, but indeed they park their reason at the door, and they believe whatever this particular God King says, or whatever this sort of new age. I don't even, in some cases, I've been told some strange things that people believe. Whatever it is, I can't, it's hard to even articulate. So the atheist who believes in no God and really doesn't take anyone's word for anything, but uses their own reason, I'd much prefer to someone who believes in various higher powers, because those higher powers are generally channeled by people who may or may not have the goodness of all humanity in their minds.
Okay.
And
Scott,
we see that time and again. I don't want to take up too much time with one
we
question.
have lots of questions coming in.
Okay.
So there's two questions relating to belief systems. So firm beliefs and whether you believe they are a form of idolatry. One has to do with people's belief in guns and the right to own guns. And the other question has to do with, the white supremacists and QAnon. And do both of those convictions and points of view come under a definition of idolatry in your belief system?
Well, QAnon, let's take that for one. There's no question that's a sort of idolatry. They believe in this Q who reveals truth, or has some sort of super authority, super knowledge, tells truth that's revealed only to those people who know them. And it's classic idolatry. It's not even, I don't have to push the definition at all. It's exactly what I've been defining. And people who are part of that subgroup believe that they have this special revealed knowledge, and somehow people who don't understand it can be demonized, delegitimized. They haven't seen the truth. Those QAnon people don't think that they share a humanity with us who are on this phone or anybody else, but certainly not with, probably this is primarily a Jewish group, certainly not with the bulk of people here, because we're not part of that God King group. We can't definitionally be part of that God King group. And the person with super authority, their God King, is telling them, well, here's what you need to do. So that's dangerous. Now, by the way, the QAnon people generally have several gods. It's like what I was talking about before. It's not just Q, it's other gods. And they buy into conspiracy theories, classic conspiracy theories. Now, here's the thing about conspiracy theories. They're non-falsifiable, and they come from someone who somehow reveals them. And they all tend to, by the way, there's two, Jason Brevard and Kasim Kassam have both written the classic texts on conspiracy theories. And they're both a little bit surprised, but they both certainly come to the conclusion that strangely, all conspiracy theories, all major conspiracy theories that are harmful seem to come down to Jews somehow. So there are a few conspiracy theories that, like Elvis is alive or Paul is dead, that don't have that problem. But if you scratch at all the other conspiracy theories, major conspiracy theories, then frankly, they somehow put the Jews as the enemy. And that's what happened certainly in QAnon. I really want to have my chance to, go and see the control panel for the Jewish space laser. We all would.
Scott, I want to get in Rabbi Sid Schwartz's question before he has to leave. So,
Okay.
but I want to say something before that. I want to acknowledge Giddy Eteman. Giddy said that he's from Philadelphia. He's reading the book In Good Faith in his book club, and he is a Baha'i. So just for the record, not everybody on this call is of the Jewish faith, but anyway. So Rabbi Schwartz says, perhaps an extension of the last question, are we not witnessing the emergence of extreme forms of religion as a form of idolatry as well? In such forms, ethics is made secondary to regimented action and belief, raised to the level of an idol by authoritarian leaders.
Well, for sure, the risk is that monotheism can be weaponized in the guise and under the false and be a false guise for idolatry. And let me give you an example. We have 3 commandments, the way the Jews count them, 3 commandments. First one is to believe in the God that freed us from Egypt, and etc. The second thing is not to have false idols. And the third, I'm over summarizing here, but the third, the way we count it, the Aseret HaDibrot, is not to take God's name in vain, not to take God's name b'shav. And a lot of us were brought up thinking that we're supposed to make a dash between G and D, or and we do take it seriously in terms of writing God's ineffable name. But the reality is this, that the true risk of religion is when a God King Pharaoh figures out how to harness that religion and as I said, weaponize it. So for example, and I'm going to bring in the gentleman from Philadelphia who is a Baha'i. When Ayatollah Khamenei came to power, he said essentially that he was the sole spokesperson for God. And the Ayatollahs and supreme leaders in Iran continue to continue to say that they are the sole spokesperson for God. And whenever anyone declares themselves as a sole spokesperson for God, we're in deep trouble. So what was the first thing that happened after 1979? Because the Baha'i were not considered a revealed religion, were not considered a valid religion because they happened after the Prophet Muhammad, Baha'i folks were not considered in Iran to have a right to life. And there was a mini genocide actually that took place in Iran. And that's why a lot of Baha'i escaped to the extent they could to LA, to Chicago, to other places. And
Still
that's the thing.
happening.
Excuse me?
Still happening.
Still, the genocide, the mini genocide is still happening there because it's declared, and that's a serious, serious danger. Anyone, and let me even say this, even when the whole notion of Roman Catholic popes being infallible is a relatively recent idea. It's an 1876, I think, 1880 idea. That was when it was promulgated. And even then, the Roman Catholic popes have only invoked that once. And that was with a matter of theology. Because even within the Roman Catholic Church at the time, there was this notion that nobody is really infallible. Nobody really has a direct line to God that they can say, I'm going to tell you what God thinks, because I have that soul line to God. Because once you do that, you are essentially placing yourself in the place of God, which is idolatry, it's deification. So yes, monotheism can be subverted by idolatry, and that's the risk. And what we're called upon to do as Jews in the Bible and by the Talmud is to scrutinize, argue. Don't take anyone's word as the sole word. There's 70 faces of God. There are many, many voices of interpretation, and that's what can keep us honest. And we have to do that. We have to do that if we're going to be a light unto the nations.
Thanks, Scott. So on that same vein, Marcia has a question for you about science. When you talk about questioning, she asks, do we not worship at the altar of science when we are not questioning instead of taking that which is researched as absolute truths? So what is the role of science in terms of idolatry?
Well, first of all, I think that's a great question, because there's a difference between science and scientism. Science needs to be understood for what it is, which is to create hypotheses, to try to test those hypotheses, to create theories, and then to do everything you can to see if you can find an exception to theory. Indeed, right now, the existence of a new subatomic particle may be overthrowing our understanding of the standard model in quantum mechanics. Stunning if that happens. It works really well. I mean, Newton's laws of gravitation worked great for centuries until Einstein came up with something better. And by the way, it took a long time to prove it, because Newtonian physics works really well as long as you don't start taking into account planets and movements and stars and the like. So everything in science is tentative. Now, things work. I mean, we know that if I drop a book, it's going to fall, but we don't necessarily know that it's going to fall a billionth of a second different or a trillionth of a second different, depending on where I am or how high I am, because it doesn't matter. But when we start saying things like the science says, or imputing into things that science can't know, and I read about this at some length, which is science cannot really tell us anything about how the universe came into being. It has nothing to say about that in reality. And when you read whole books like Lawrence Krauss's book, who's a well-known atheist who writes about how the universe was created from nothing, considering it to be a quantum blip in nothingness that somehow led to everything. Well, that's really nice, except there's no proof of that whatsoever. And math is no proof for anything physical. I mean, that's why Nobel Prizes in physics are only awarded once there's an actual physical proof. The thing that strikes me as where sort of science comes, people who use scientism sort of come around at themselves in a full circle, is the whole notion of, yes, it is so, and scientists recognize this and physicists recognize it, is so improbable that the world exists, that this planet exists, that atoms are able to interact into molecules that allow us to actually, for there to be thinking beings, indeed, that we've gone before stars that have hydrogen and helium, that they propose this concept of the multiverse. And the multiverse is the notion that, now I'm not talking about the Marvel comic universe, I'm talking about the multiverse as scientists talk about it, that from this sort of quantum distortion, that an infinite number of universes were created. And so, yes, it is highly improbable that that there can be any sort of atomic structure, much less life. I mean, there's 6 constants that are famously talked about as the major 6 constants of physics, which have no, there's no way to derive them. They just are numbers, literally numbers. And some of them are hundreds of numbers to the right of the decimal point. And if you start to multiply these numbers, as I say, they're not even, it's not even as though getting one right is enough. You have to get 6 numbers precisely right. It's like winning 6 lotteries in a row, 6 Powerball lotteries in a row with odds much worse than the Powerball, any Powerball lottery. But if you only won 5 of them, you got nothing. So some scientists have proffered that since there's an infinite number of universes, we just happen to live on this universe, in this world, in this particular universe, that has come together in a random fashion, so improbably, that life exists. Now, that's okay, it's possible, but the odds are really low. And to say that that's a better argument than there was a creator, and that's how we ended up with this universe, is really a belief purely. Whether it's an idolater's belief or not, I don't need to get into that now, but it's purely a belief. There is no proof for it whatsoever, nor can a scientist who you sit down say that there's any proof. It makes sense because they posit there's no God. And so how do we end up with this universe? So if you join in the suppositions, it can, but there's no proof. And so people who ask science to say things that it can't say, some people, Sam Harris is famous for saying that science should show us how we can have ethics. Well, no, science cannot show how there can be a system of ethics. There is no, I mean, I've listened to him, I've read him, but again, it's a situation where where it goes around in a full circle, and there is no proof. And to just reference the science is referencing, one particular, another particular God King avatar. So that was a little bit of a long-winded answer, but I think it was an important question.
So Bennett Nagel asks a follow-up question about this. He says, what concerns you most about the state of belief today? Or the lack of state of belief today? Or
well, what concerns me is that there's a lot of excess belief. And again, excess belief in idolatry. And I think that the major religions, the major organized religious groups, have been afraid, for whatever reason, to confront head on um, the issues. And I mean this in a, I think what I say might sound harsher than I intend, but on the other hand, I think it is important. I think the mainstream, for example, Protestant groups feel buffeted by feeling that they are less relevant, by declining numbers. And so to a certain degree, they've latched onto certain social justice initiatives, but have not employed them, but have not approached them, that's a better word term, as entry lanes to belief in a monotheistic God, in the God of Isaiah, in the God of Yechezkel, in the God of Yeshayahu, in the God, of course, of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Abraham, but in the gods of the prophets who demanded justice, who demanded social justice. And once religion is made to just be an adjunct to whatever is the social justice primary issue of the day, as opposed to social justice springing from our belief in God and our commitment to social justice coming and emerging from our belief that, yes, everybody is created in the image of God. That's what we're put here on earth to do, to make that vision reality. But rather, it just, when it becomes too integrated with whatever is the issue of the day, and there's the hope that by aligning with those issues, that belief will somehow emerge. Well, that's not really how it works, because people get involved in movements, and then the movement itself becomes, to a certain degree, a ideology that people sign on to with super authority, and that's very dangerous. And again, people do believe. The one thing that I've also encountered is that, or I've also come to believe, is that the default mode for people is idolatry. I mean, before the Bible, essentially everybody was an idolater. That was the default mode of humanity, is idolatry. We naturally want someone to explain things to us, someone to tell us what the truth is, because we don't want to try to do the work of figuring out themselves. I mean, I am stunned at how many people just believe who they follow on a social media, feed. It's just breathtaking. And again, I've been at some forums on private events with some really, really intelligent millennials and Gen Xers, and they're saying, and in terms of belief, they'll say X or Y, or the people, or the people think this, people think that. And it's really scary. Now, I don't put that in the same category as QAnon, or as some of the crazy, some of the crazy conspiracy theories that we read about, but it's there. And that the sense that we're going to listen to who's ever telling us what the conspiracy theory at hand is scary. I'm going to give you one biblical story. It's from the second book of Kings. I think it's chapter 17. I could be wrong, but it's when the Arameans are setting siege to Samaria. And we just read about the part of the story, for those of you who followed Haftarah, in last Shabbat. where there's the story of the four lepers, who actually play a minor role in this whole story. What happens? The Israelites are facing utter starvation in Samaria. They're dying. They're literally starving. There's a story that precedes this about how a mother eats, how two mothers decide to eat their babies. I mean, it's just terrible. The horses are starving. The king is ready to give up. The lepers don't go back to the city. They figure, let's go to this Aramean camp and maybe they'll take pity on us. They even know there's no food in the city. And what happens? God made a noise, big noises. And what did the Arameans say to themselves? They said, the Israelite kings must have offered money to the Hittites and to the Egyptian kings to come as mercenaries and to defeat us. Now, there was no evidence of that, no evidence whatsoever. And indeed, the Hittites and Egyptians kings were probably rooting for Israel to fall. But that conspiracy theory became so compelling that all of the Arameans abandoned their camp, left the animals there, left the food there, and ran for their lives because they were telling each other, we're going to get defeated, we're going to get killed, we're going to get massacred, things are bad, we better go. This is what we're being told. This is what we believe, with no evidence whatsoever. And now, there were facts, because don't forget, every army has scouts who must have looked out and not seen any armies in any distance. There were only these four friggin' lepers. So the scouts were saying, well, nothing's happening. And armies are used to facing gambits and stratagems against us. And they're in the business of judging reality. But this conspiracy theory overtook them and they all fled for their lives. And then when the four lepers came in and saw this stunningly abandoned camp and finally went and told the people in the city, no one could believe it, that they were trampled because the food was abundant. The camp was fully stocked. So even people with power can fall into these conspiracy theories. And the Bible is saying they are really powerful. They are really, really powerful, these conspiracy theories.
So there's another question about the cancel culture today and conspiracy theories and the cancel culture in terms of idolatrous beliefs. Could you tie that into what you just were talking about?
Sure. I mean, look, cancel culture is a disaster for humanity, because once we stop talking to each other, again, we're going to fall into our idolatrous God king camps. And the whole idea, and this is, Audrey, which, I talk about, you probably heard me talk about, I don't know, 12,000 times at this point, which is the golden rule, treating others as you would want yourself treated. You wouldn't want yourself dismissed or not permitted to even be part of the conversation, part of society, if it was because you had some belief, or you did something once in your life, or you said something or posted something once in your life, that everything else doesn't matter. You wouldn't want yourself to be treated that way, and so you shouldn't treat anybody else that way, which is, of course, I wouldn't want to be treated that way. I shouldn't treat anyone else that way, as though they need to be shunned. It is a matter it's part and parcel of idolatry. Because if that person does anything to indicate that they're not part of my God King group, then they're out. They're out. And look, the history is, that in revolutions, the most dangerous place to be is adjacent in ideology to the revolutionaries. I mean, the Trotskyites were thrown out. And Trotsky was, of course, assassinated. And the parties that aligned with the communists who originally took over and created the Soviet Union were mostly massacred. because they were close, but they weren't exactly that pure ideology that people who align with the God King Pharaoh crave. And so if you do something that indicates that you're not part of that purity, or as Mary J. Douglas would say, you're part of the pollution, then nothing can save you from the adherence of that God King Pharaoh and their operatives. And that's a really dangerous place to be. And that's, look, who gets canceled today? The cancel culture is primarily a phenomenon. We've talked about the far right, but cancel culture is primarily a phenomenon of the left in this sense, in that people who tend to get canceled are those who are pretty close. For example, the editor of the Wall Street Journal editorial page, a liberal with impeccable liberal credentials, but by printing Senator Hawley's, or he didn't even print, he didn't even see it, but letting that be printed, he was forced to resign because he wasn't pure enough. On campuses, professors who are canceled are sort of traditional liberals in many cases, but they're not pure enough. And so cancel culture tends to be a part of the left. But let me say this, it's also part of the right and the far right, because Richard Spencer, who is the leader of the alt-right and actually is the person who trademarked the name alt-right and alt-right corporation, he doesn't believe that folks on the right who don't believe in the evil of Jews are fit for being part of the movement. He calls them alt-light. And he's one of those people who came up with the acronym Kite-Bart as opposed to Breitbart, because Breitbart is not anti-Jewish. We may not like it. It may be way too far to the right, but they don't hate Jews. They have Jewish writers. Whereas Richard Spencer would say that makes them trafe. That makes them bad. And so it doesn't have the same impact as cancel culture on the left, because that cancel culture affects universities, it affects academia, it affects ideas that are taught. It's certainly part of what's going on in the entertainment world. And so, but the fundamental pillar of cancel culture is a phenomenon of idolatry, and it is just as much on the left and right, just more effective right now on the left.
So Scott, just to wrap up, so what would you like to leave people with? What are your big points that you'd like us to leave this evening's conversation with?
The golden rule.
Far-ranging.
The golden rule: don't do anything unto someone else that you would find hateful if done unto you. Hillel's formulation. That's the first thing. And when you're thinking about shunning, or hopefully no one here is shunning or demonizing or delegitimizing, remember that person is also has a spark of divinity, and it's our job to try to find that spark of divinity in others. And if we do it, we're going to be not only successful for ourselves, but we'll help make the world much more successful, make the world a better place. So that's our charge, is to find those sparks of divinity among people who we disagree. And most importantly, people who we disagree. There's a famous slogan that if you can only afford one newspaper, buy that of the opposition, because you're not going to really understand your own position unless you truly, truly understand the other side. You may reject it. It may be evil. That's a possibility. But you need to understand it. And then I really would say be vigilant for idolatry. People who are too certain in their ways, people who feel that any contradiction is dangerous. You know, unfortunately, that comes with heavy, heavy risk. And that's the primary risk that I'd leave everybody with today. It's that people are too certain. Usually they're too certain that the other person is wrong. And Hillel's formulation of the golden rule is the very, very best remedy for that.
Amen.
So I
Thank you,
want
Scott.
to thank you so much, Scott, for joining us this evening and for all of your stimulating conversation. And thank you everyone for joining us. If you'd like to continue this conversation on your own, in your own community, discussion guides are available on our website. I'll put the link in the chat box. I'll also send it out in the follow-up email. You're also invited to join Chai Mitzvah's Rabbi Deborah Smith, Reb Deb, for A Month of Faith, a 3-part series based on Scott Shay's book. The series will be held on the next 3 Tuesday evenings, April 27th, May 4th, and May 11th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. For more information or to register, please check out virtual events on the Chai Mitzvah website, chaimitzvah.org. And we're looking forward to Scott's new book, set to come out this fall. To access more information about this, as well as information about his speaking engagements, please visit scottshay.com. Thanks again for joining us, and good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.